So climate change is something that affects the entire world. And just to say, this was one of the first pictures. I think this was actually the first picture that was taken of our planet from one of the last Apollo missions. And this picture basically was one of the things that helped start the modern environmental movement. And it's important to know how precious our planet is in terms of life. Like we're still trying to find life across the galaxy, and life is quite rare. So we have to keep that in mind. Now, there's three questions I'm going to present. So, must we change? Can we change? And will we change? And this is so regarding the issue of climate change. So when we ask, must we change? It means like, why is climate change important? And I'm going to explain that throughout this presentation. Now, to us, inhabitants of the Earth, the atmosphere seems like infinite, but in reality, the atmosphere is very thin. So if you imagine an apple, the skin of the apple is basically how thick the atmosphere is compared to the Earth. So the atmosphere is actually quite thin, and it's so thin that we could in fact change its composition, which is leading to climate change. So we're emitting over 152 million tons of greenhouse gas emission every 24 hours, as if it were an open sewer. This is a huge amount of extra heat that accumulates over time. Okay, so this slide basically shows the greenhouse effect. So there's solar radiation from our planet, and basically carbon dioxide, you can think of it almost as a blanket. As the emissions of carbon dioxide increase over time, there's more and more carbon dioxide, which will trap more and more heat. Okay, I'm just gonna go back. I think. All right. So the biggest sources of greenhouse gases are the ones shown here. So there's coal plants, industrial processes, industrial agriculture, land transport, landfills, forest burning, oil production. There's also thaw and permafrost. So as the temperature goes up, permafrost in areas like Canada, Alaska, Russia, they start to melt, and that could cause a release of methane, which causes more greenhouse gases. So again, as the previous slide showed, there's something known as the greenhouse gas effect. The greenhouse effect. So the most important greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide, but there's other greenhouse gases as well. Another important one is methane. Now, the largest source of global warming pollution is the burning of fossil fuels. After World War II, so like after 1950, the burning of fossil fuels increased dramatically, as you can see in this picture. Now, if you look at the temperature, the global surface temperature from 1880 to 2019, you can see that it has in fact increased. And again, the slideshow was made in 2020, so it doesn't show like the last few years, but basically there is in fact an increase in temperature. Right now, worldwide, there's about 1 degree Celsius of temperature increase. What's important to note here that when they say it's 1 degree Celsius increase over the whole world, the reality is that in many places on land, it's more than 1 degree Celsius. So there are many places where the temperature increase is about 2 degrees Celsius. And in the Arctic region, it might be as much as 4 degree increase in Celsius. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, first, it doesn't seem like a big deal just to increase by a few degrees. But in reality, it causes a huge amount of different effects. So these are if you look from the year 2020, those were the hottest years, and the previous 5 years were the hottest years on record. 2016 used to be the hottest year on record. I think 2020 has tied it or almost surpassed it. So this shows you how things are pretty intense. So heat has many effects. It has effects on humans, animals, and it affects crops as well. Now, if you look Now, if you look at global ocean heat, there also has been an increase in heat, whether it's at the surface of the ocean or deeper in the ocean. There has been an increase over time in temperature. Now, we've always had hurricanes, but the thing is that with climate change, we have more powerful hurricanes. And one of the reasons is that as the ocean temperature increases, this causes more moisture in the air and more well, basically when the ocean is hotter, hurricanes become more powerful. So because of climate change, we're going to see more Category 5 hurricanes. Now, another thing that's important to note is that as temperatures increase, there's more evaporation, which causes more precipitation. So there's something known as a hydrological cycle. And the thing is, because of climate change, there will actually be more floods and more droughts, which at first might seem like a contradiction. But again, because there's more evaporation, certain areas will have a lot more rain, so a lot more floods. But also because there's so much more evaporation, there are certain areas in the world that's going to suffer more drought, which could cause more famine and so on. Also, as the temperature increases, there's a higher amount of rain that can be poured, and you can have like very large amounts of rain. So there are massive floods that are happening all over the world. And again, climate change just increases the likelihood of stuff like floods, heat waves, droughts, wildfires, hurricanes, and many other things. So I said before, the same extra heat that evaporates more water could also cause more droughts, which could cause more floods. So as you see in this graph, it says as it pulls more moisture more quickly from the soil, this causes longer and deeper droughts. So climate change has an effect on agriculture throughout the world. So again, just to say one more time, there will be certain areas in the world which will have more droughts, more severe droughts, and other areas will have more floods. So this is like a picture, an example of drought. Now, there's a connection between hotter years and more intense wildfires. So as this graph shows, so again, when it tends to get hotter, it tends to have more wildfires. We've seen a lot of massive wildfires in the last few years, places like California and places like Australia. In Canada, there was actually a massive wildfire at Fort McMurray, which is actually close to where the tar sands are, which is the large oil fields. So this is important to mention that climate change doesn't just affect a few countries. Climate change affects pretty much every single country, including Canada. And not long ago, I think last summer or a year ago, we had like extremely high temperatures in certain areas of Canada, hitting over 40 degrees Celsius. Now, overall, the worldwide extreme weather catastrophes are increasing, whether they're storms, floods, or stuff like droughts and fires. And insurance companies have seen this as well, that there's more claims that they have to deal with because of more natural disasters. Now there's a change in glaciers. So you can see a lot of glaciers around the world are losing their ice sheet. So they're melting basically over time. So there's glaciers on land that are melting. There's also the Arctic ice that's getting thinner and smaller over decades. There's also ice in Antarctica that's melting as well. So this is an example of floods that people are having. Oh, okay, and for sea level rise, most people don't realize how bad sea level rise could be. So in this graph, it shows that by the year 2070, there could be literally trillions of dollars in damages. So just in Miami, it could be about $2.5 trillion in damages, like assets at risk, in just that one city. And you can see here, New York, could have over $2 trillion in damages from sea level rise by the year 2070. And there's also a lot of people who will be affected by sea level rise. So these are the cities that will be affected the most in terms of population. So many millions of people will be affected. And just like these particular cities, there will be many millions of people who will be affected. The US Department of Defense has said that climate change will likely lead to food and water shortages, pandemic disease, disputes over refugees, and natural disasters in regions across the globe. So basically, it's important to know that the US military is basically saying that climate change is a national security issue. So that's important to note. Because once we have more food shortages across the world, that could cause a whole series of problems. It could cause more wars, more civil wars. It could cause a lot of environmental refugees, and that affects national security. And the reality is that crops are in fact sensitive to heat, and that can have many severe impacts. There's a lot of effects on the agriculture because climate change will change precipitation patterns, which could also affect plants, and there could also be massive floods which could destroy crops. So climate change affects agriculture in several ways. Climate change is a medical emergency. And one of the reasons it's a medical emergency is that it could spread many different tropical diseases. So tropical diseases are on the move on many places around the world. I'm going to mention my website after, my website Climate Change Guide, and I have an article about dengue fever and an article about malaria and salmonella. So basically climate change could cause certain diseases to be worse and to spread more. One of the reasons why diseases are spread is that mosquitoes are able to go to new areas. And that includes, for instance, the Zika virus or malaria. The mosquitoes could reach new regions. So for instance, the mosquito that's the carrier of the Zika virus could reach new areas because of climate change. This is an important fact. We risk losing 50% of all land-based species in this century. So it's estimated that by the year 2100, if things don't go well, we could lose over 1 million species, which would be absolutely devastating to ecosystems, because ecosystems, basically species depend on each other. So if 1 million species go extinct, it can have very devastating impacts. So this is the cost of carbon. So political instability, if you look at the top left, political instability, so that it could cause more civil wars and cause many different environmental refugees. There was actually an article that said it could be over 1 billion climate refugees by the year 2070. So if you imagine the impact of a few million refugees, like we had in recent years, imagine the impact over 1 billion refugees that could have very severe impacts. Now, it could cause more floods and mudslides, more severe wildfires, droughts, storms. There's also ocean acidification. So basically, the entire marine food web is affected by what's called ocean acidification. So as the oceans absorb carbon dioxide, this changes the acidity, and the increase in acidity affects some small species, which are at the bottom of the food chain, which affects the entire food chain. So there's that. There's infrastructure loss, climate refugees, as I mentioned before, species extinction, melting glaciers, famine, water scarcity, ecosystem loss. People's way of life could be different, especially like in poor countries. Infectious diseases will spread and sea level will rise. And again, it's important to note that sea level will cause literally trillions of dollars in damages. And overall, the cost of carbon is considered the #1 threat to the global economy. So must we change? The answer is yes, because climate change is severe. Now the second question is, can we change? So basically we have the solutions at hand. We already have the technology to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by a lot. So in 2000, they projected that worldwide wind capacity will reach 30 gigawatts by 2010. But in reality, by 2019, they were able to exceed that by 22 times. So basically, there ended up being more wind power than people have projected. And something's very similar with solar power as well. So global wind energy capacity from 1980 to 2019, you can see there's a very fast increase, which is a good sign. But it's also important to note that we're not moving fast enough in reducing greenhouse gases, even though the use of wind energy is going up dramatically. And same thing with solar power. So global wind capacity could supply worldwide electricity consumption 40 times over. Also, there's a huge amount of solar energy that can be produced that could meet all of humanity's energy needs. So similarly, in 2002, they projected the energy market will grow by 1 gigawatt per year. And then in reality, it was increased by a lot higher than that. In 2019, it was 121 times that. So solar power is actually going up faster than people projected. But unfortunately, it's still not going fast enough because we still need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by quite a bit. So this graph shows solar photovoltaic installations. As you can see, they have increased dramatically. And this is something very important to understand. The price of solar power has decreased dramatically. So in 1976, it was like almost $80 per watt. And by 2020, it's 2019 is 25 cents per watt. And in the last few years, I think it continued to decrease even further. Because solar power is cheaper now, a lot more people are able to use it. And in many places, solar power is as cheap or cheaper than coal power. So this is a very good news. That means that we can adopt solar power a lot faster. Low initial costs make small solar systems affordable in developing countries. So basically, in countries where there isn't a strong electricity grid, basically solar power could be very useful. This shows the explosion in the solar market in Chile and South America. So basically, there was a very vast increase in solar power. And we see this in other places around the world as well. And one of the main things is basically because, like I said before, the price of solar power is decreasing a lot, so people are able to install a lot more. There's enough solar energy that reaches the Earth every hour to fill all the world's energy needs for a full year. So basically, just with solar power, we do have enough to power the whole world. And in terms of alternative energy, we have solar power, wind power, hydropower, wave power, tidal power, geothermal. Geothermal is like when they take heat from the Earth. And there's also, there's also nuclear energy. Nuclear power could also make a lot of electricity without greenhouse gas emissions. Nuclear power is like kind of debated in the environmentalist community, but there are environmentalists, including myself, who believe that nuclear power could in fact help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions by a lot. So there's many different ways you can have renewable energy. Now this is the global cumulative storage capacity in terms of batteries. One thing that's important is that if we capture electricity by solar power or by wind power, we need to store it in batteries. And basically, the good news is that storage capacity is projected to increase a lot and has already increased by quite a bit. So this is good news. As there are more batteries and as battery technology improves, we could store wind power and solar power, which could help the issue of climate change. Also, LED lights are being used a lot more. So by the year 2025, it's estimated that could be 95% of the lighting market, when in 2010 it was only 1%. So LED lights compared to the older version, basically LED lights save electricity, and so they last longer, so you don't have to change them as often. Many auto manufacturers are turning to electric vehicles. There are many countries where where it's planned to only make electric vehicles by the year 2035 or 2040. So even in Canada, I think if I'm not mistaken, they're making a law that by a certain year we only allow electric cars. So that's good news as well. The biggest one by far is definitely Tesla. And Tesla is very famous for electric cars. But it's important to note that there's many other manufacturers that are making electric cars. So can we change? Yes, because we have the technology. But and the last question is, will we change? So the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, every nation in the world agreed to work together to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. So during the Trump administration, Trump basically wanted to get the US out of the climate agreement. It was a very bad idea. Technically, he was able to do that, but only at the very end of his term. So not long after the 2020 presidential election, in November, he was able to get the United States out of the climate agreement. But with the new administration, with Joe Biden, in January 2021, they actually got the United States back into the climate agreement. And the US has done a lot. There was a very large law passed recently where the Joe Biden administration invested hundreds of billions of dollars to help combat climate change. There are really large marches for the climate in recent years. Here's one in Washington, D.C. in 2017. I went to a climate march in Montreal in 2019. I guess you guys probably remember I think it was estimated about 500,000 people were marching in Montreal in 2019 for the climate. Greta Thunberg was there. Greta Thunberg became very famous for her protest, which she still does today. And Greta Thunberg was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and I think she was Person of the Year on Time magazine, I think for the year 2019. So there are a lot of people who are aware of this. I still believe that we need even more awareness, because even though a lot of people are aware, they may not be aware of how bad climate change really is. But there is awareness. It's a good news. So join those who are using their voices, their votes, their choices to fight the climate crisis. Use your voice, your vote, your choices. Speak truth to power, like your world depends on it, because the world does depend on it. Now, if people want to see more, you can see the movie An Inconvenient Sequel. I saw a movie. I have the first one and the second one. The Inconvenient Sequel was made like 10 years after the first one. It's a very good documentary. And Gore also has a book about it. And now, if you have time, I could mention my website. Do you have time?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, feel free.
All right. So basically, the presentation I just gave now is these are slides from Climate Reality. If you're interested in doing more climate activism, you can go to Climate Reality. Now, if people want to go really intense on the science, there's a very good website called Skeptical Science where they really go deep into the science. So, like for instance, on the website Skeptical Science, they mention arguments that skeptics would say. For instance, they may say it's not. Some people may claim that it's not greenhouse gases, but it's the sun that's causing the global warming. And basically on the website, they'll explain, for instance, the sun's energy has decreased since the 1980s, but the Earth keeps getting warmer faster than before. So it's not activity by the sun which is causing us to get warm in the last few years. It's actually because of greenhouse gas emissions. And then on their website, they'll explain on the basic level, intermediate level, and advanced level, where they explain more deeply the science behind it. There's also the website NASA Climate Change. This is a website I recommend as well. NASA is probably one of the best ones. So there's a lot of facts that they explain on the website, and the website is pretty good. So here, for instance, they mentioned the parts per million of carbon dioxide is almost 100. It's almost 420 parts per million. To give you an idea, right before the Industrial Revolution, so let's say before 1780, the carbon dioxide level was about 280 parts per million. And now it's 420 parts per million. So yeah. And anyway, so this website gives you a lot of detail about it. Now, my own website is called the Climate Change Guide, climatechangeguide.com. I created a website in 2011, so it's been over 10 years. And my website has over 100 web pages and basically gives you information about climate change. So if you go here, climate change basics, there's an overview of climate change. I have the effects of climate change. So like for instance, here I mentioned it will worsen droughts, dust storms, floods, heat waves, hurricanes, tropical storms, tornadoes, and wildfires. This page here, effects of climate change, is important. So I mentioned a lot of things. Hottest years on record, environmental refugees. Like I said before in the presentation, it's predicted that there could be over 1 billion refugees by 2070, which could have a very devastating impact. Cause more extreme weather, first tornadoes, dust storms, floods. It could on certain lakes there could be impacts. So certain lakes might actually shrink because of climate change. But to give an example, Lake Chad was once one of the biggest lakes in the world, and it shrank dramatically. This was a mixture of climate change, but also of other causes as well. But that's something important to take note of. There could be more desertification, which means that less land will be able to grow crops, which could be devastating in poor countries. Shortages of food and water. So there's many different causes of this. Extinction of species, acidification. If we go here, for instance, I talk about this in more detail. More than 90% of the excess energy is accumulated in the atmosphere goes into the ocean. So yeah, like I said before, when acidity goes up in the ocean, this affects marine life, especially the marine life at the bottom of the marine food chain. This affects the entire marine food chain. So yeah, so on my website I have a lot of information about climate change, many different things. If people want to request a presentation similar to the one I did now, if people go to Climate Reality, they could see it.